After every landlord turned Denise Calloway and her 4 children away, one freezing night on a park bench forced Gerald and Lorraine Whitmore to face the grief behind their closed door and discover that saving a homeless family might be the only way to heal their own. The eviction notice was taped to Denise Calloway's front door when she came home from work. The building had been sold, and every tenant had 30 days to move out. No extension, no special cases. Denise read the page twice while standing in the hallway, still wearing the shoes she had walked 40 minutes in to save bus fare. From inside the apartment, she could hear her children arguing over dinner. She folded the notice, slipped it into her purse, and opened the door with a smile. Jalen was sitting at the kitchen table, dividing one fried egg between himself and his 3 younger siblings. He gave the largest piece to Nyla and pushed the next one toward Miles. Zara complained that her piece was smaller, so Jalen told her it only looked that way because her plate was bigger. She believed him. Denise stood in the doorway for a second, watching her 8-year-old son solve a problem that should never have belonged to him. Then she kissed each child, added water to the beans on the stove, and asked how school had gone. No one noticed that she barely ate. Denise moved around the kitchen, checked homework, wiped Nyla's face, and promised Zara she would redo her braids before school. Miles asked if they could have pancakes on Saturday. Denise told him they would see, because "we'll see" was safer than a promise she might not be able to keep. Jalen stayed quiet and watched her more closely than the others. Before bed, he took out the trash without being asked, then stood near the kitchen as if he were waiting for her to explain something. Denise kept washing the same plate until he finally walked away. After the apartment went silent, she spread the notice across the kitchen table. A new apartment would require an application fee, a deposit, and the first month's rent. Denise had $86 left after paying bills, and part of that money had to cover Nyla's medicine. She searched rental listings on her phone, writing down every place she might be able to afford. 3 were too expensive, 2 required higher income, and 1 would not accept a family with 4 children. By midnight, only 2 numbers remained on her list. Denise had survived being left before. 2 years earlier, Terrence had walked out while she and the children were sleeping. He took his clothes, his car, and the money from their bank account. He left no note and did not answer his phone. For weeks, Denise kept expecting him to return with an explanation, but none came. The morning she realized he was truly gone, she sat on the kitchen floor and cried until Nyla began calling from her crib. Denise stood up because the baby believed her mother would always come, and Denise could not be the second person to disappear. Since then, she had kept the family together through small sacrifices the children rarely noticed. She walked to work when bus fare meant fewer diapers. She repaired clothes after midnight and learned to cut the children's hair herself. When there was not enough food, she told them she had already eaten at work. The apartment was cramped, the elevator had been broken for years, and the bathroom faucet never stopped dripping, but it was the only home the children remembered. Now, Denise had 30 days to find another place before that small sense of safety was taken from them. She hid the notice beneath a stack of bills in the kitchen drawer. What she did not know was that Jalen had been standing at the end of the hallway. He had seen her count the money, cross out the listings, and press both hands against her face when she thought no one was watching. He returned to bed without making a sound. The next evening, Denise came home and found an old cardboard box in the living room. Jalen was kneeling beside it, sorting their birth certificates, school records, medical papers, and the current lease into plastic folders. He smoothed every page before placing it inside, careful not to bend the corners. Denise put down her bag and asked what he was doing. Jalen looked toward the bedroom to make sure the younger children could not hear. "I found the notice," he said. Denise wanted to tell him everything would be fine, but he had heard too many promises followed by empty cupboards and unpaid bills. She sat down beside him instead. Jalen picked up Nyla's birth certificate and placed it carefully with the others. "I don't know where we're going next," he said. "I thought we should keep the papers that prove we belong together." Denise turned toward the window before he could see her face. Jalen should have been worried about spelling tests in cartoons, not documents that proved his family was real. She took a slow breath, then helped him finish packing the box. When they were done, Jalen wrote Calloway family across the top in black marker and placed it beneath Denise's bed. That night, Denise opened her notebook and wrote down the 2 remaining phone numbers. Above them, she added one sentence and underlined it twice. Find a home. Keep the children together. The next morning, she called the first landlord. He sounded friendly until she told him how many children she had. Denise waited until Saturday morning to tell the children they had to start packing. By then, she had called every number in her notebook, left 6 messages, and spoken to 3 landlords. None had offered them a place, but the 30-day deadline was getting closer. She placed 4 small bags on the living room floor and told the children they were moving somewhere new. She did not tell them that she still had no idea where that place would be. She only said they could each bring what mattered most. Zara went first. She ran to the bedroom and returned holding Queenie, the stuffed bear she had carried since she was 3. One of Queenie's eyes was missing, and a safety pin held part of her side together, but Zara treated her like something valuable. She packed 2 shirts, a pair of socks, and then spent several minutes trying to make room for a box of crayons. When the crayons would not fit, she removed one of the shirts. Denise noticed but said nothing. Zara had already learned that comfort sometimes had to be traded for something that made the world feel less frightening. Miles chose his old blanket and a toy car with 1 broken wheel. The blanket was too small to cover him now, but he still rubbed the corner between his fingers whenever he was tired. He rolled it tightly and pushed it into the bag, then placed the car on top as carefully as if it were new. Neela did not understand the rules. She wandered through the apartment holding her blue plastic cup and tried to place a cooking spoon, 1 shoe, and a roll of toilet paper into her bag. In the end, Denise packed clothes and diapers for her, but Nyla refused to let go of the cup. Jalen sat on the floor beside an empty backpack. Denise watched him look around the room at his books, his school medal, and the small plastic dinosaur Miles had given him for his birthday. He touched each item but chose none of them. Instead, he walked to the bathroom for Nyla's medicine, took diapers from the bedroom, and added tissues, wipes, and extra clothes for the younger children. He packed the family documents he had organized the night before and placed them in a plastic bag to keep them dry. When he finished, there was no room left for anything that belonged only to him. "You can take 1 toy," Denise told him. Jalen pulled the zipper closed. "I'm good." The answer came too quickly. Denise wanted to open the bag and make space for something, but she knew he would only remove it after she walked away. Jalen had begun measuring every choice by what the family might need later. At 8 years old, he no longer asked what he wanted. He asked what could be carried, saved, or used by someone smaller than him. Denise reached for his shoulder, but he stood up before she could touch him and carried Nyla's bag into the bedroom. That afternoon, Denise found Zara lying on her stomach near the window, drawing on the back of an old grocery flyer. The picture showed a brown house with a red door and a bright yellow light above it. 5 people stood inside the house, their arms drawn as long lines connecting them. 2 more people stood outside the door. Denise recognized herself in the children, but she did not know who the others were. "Who are those 2?" she asked. Zara kept coloring the light over the door. "They're the people who don't know yet that they might become part of our family." Denise almost told her that families did not happen that way. People did not simply appear when you needed them. Terrence had taught her the opposite. Even people who promised to stay could leave without warning. But Zara looked certain, as if she were drawing something she had already seen. Denise folded the picture carefully and placed it between the family documents in Jalen's backpack. She did not know why she saved it. She only knew she could not throw it away. That evening, Denise made rice and canned soup while the children finished packing. She checked each bag and removed anything too heavy, then wrote their names on pieces of tape. When she opened Jalen's backpack, she found 1 granola bar hidden beneath Nyla's clothes. The wrapper was bent at the corners, as though it had been moved from pocket to pocket for days. Denise knew it had come from the breakfast program at school. "You forgot to eat this," she said. Jalen did not look at her. "I was saving it." "For what?" He glanced toward the kitchen table, where Miles and Zara were helping Nyla stack plastic cups. "For when you say you already ate at work." Denise held the granola bar in her hand. She had used that lie so often that she had started to believe the children did not notice. Jalen noticed everything. He noticed when the milk disappeared faster near payday, when Denise wore the same shoes after the soles split, and when she moved food around her plate instead of eating it. He had been carrying the granola bar because he expected his mother to go hungry again. Denise broke the bar in half. She gave one piece to Jalen and ate the other while he watched. Neither of them spoke. It was a small thing, barely enough to quiet their stomachs, but Denise understood what he needed to see. For once, she would not pretend she had eaten. For once, he would not have to save her in secret. Later, the 4 bags stood in a row beside the front door. They looked too small to hold a family's life. Queenie's worn head stuck out of Zara's bag, Miles's broken car rested in the side pocket of his, and Nyla's blue cup sat on top of her clothes. Jalen's backpack was the heaviest, though almost nothing inside belonged to him. Denise stared at the bags and realized the children were ready to leave before she had found anywhere for them to go. Then her phone rang. A landlord named Gerald Whitmore had received her message. He had a 3-bedroom house available, and after hearing about her job and rental history, he agreed to meet her the following morning. For the first time in days, Denise allowed herself to feel hopeful. She did not know that Gerald's answer would change the moment he counted the children. By the 3rd apartment viewing, Denise had stopped telling the children they were going to see a possible new home. Hope made every rejection harder, especially for Zara and Miles, who had already started asking which room they might share. Instead, Denise told them they were going to play a game. They had to walk softly, speak only when someone asked them a question, and keep their hands away from furniture, walls, and decorations. Neela was too young to understand, so Jalen carried her whenever he could. Denise called them her good little cats, because cats knew how to enter a room without disturbing anything. "Whoever stays quiet the longest will be the best little cat," she told them outside the first building. Miles immediately placed one finger over his lips. Zara held Queenie against her chest so the bear's loose safety pin would not scrape against anything. Jalen did not smile or play along. He understood what his mother was really asking. They had to prove they could take up less space than 4 children normally did. Denise straightened Zara's collar, wiped a spot from Miles's cheek, and checked that Nyla's blue cup was safely inside the diaper bag before leading them upstairs. The landlord sat behind a desk covered with application forms. He greeted Denise politely and asked about her job, income, and rental history. She answered every question clearly and handed him a letter from her employer confirming that she had steady work. For a few moments, the meeting seemed to be going well. Then his eyes reached the line marked Dependents. He looked at the number, glanced past Denise at the 4 children waiting silently near the wall, and placed the application back on the desk. "This building is better suited for quiet tenants," he said. Denise looked toward her children. Miles was holding his breath, as if even breathing might ruin their chance. Zara had tucked Queenie behind her back, and Jalen stood beside Nyla with one hand resting on her shoulder. None of them had spoken or touched anything since entering the office. Denise turned back to the landlord. "My children aren't looking for a place to make noise," she said. "They're looking for somewhere they can sleep without being awakened and told to leave." The landlord avoided her eyes. He repeated that the building had strict rules and said he could not make exceptions. Denise wanted to ask what rule they had broken by simply standing there. She wanted to remind him that children could be quiet and adults could still be cruel. Instead, she thanked him for his time because the children were watching, and she would not teach them that dignity disappeared when someone treated them unfairly. Outside, Miles smiled proudly. "I won the game," he whispered. I didn't say anything. Denise crouched and fixed the zipper on his jacket. You did everything right. Then do we get the house? She paused only for a second, but Jalen noticed. Before Denise could answer, he took Miles's hand and told him they were going to see another place. He said it with enough confidence that Miles believed him. Denise stood and followed, wishing she could protect Jalen from understanding things before the others did. The second apartment was across town, above a small grocery store. Denise had called that morning, and the woman on the phone had sounded friendly. She said the unit was still available and told Denise to come by any time before 4. The red apartment available sign filled most of the front window when they arrived. Denise saw 2 bedrooms through the glass, a small kitchen, and enough floor space for the children's 4 bags. It was not perfect, but it was close to a bus line and within walking distance of an elementary school. The woman opened the door with a smile, but the smile changed when she counted the children. She looked at Denise, then at Jalen, Zara, Miles, and Nyla. Her hand tightened around the edge of the door. I'm sorry, she said. Someone rented it this morning. I forgot to take the sign down. Denise knew it was a lie. The woman had confirmed the apartment was available less than 3 hours earlier. There were no moving boxes, no signed papers on the table, and no new tenant arriving behind them. Still, Denise did not argue. A person willing to lie while looking at 4 children would not become kinder because she was challenged. They walked back toward the bus stop in silence. The game was over, but the children kept playing it. Miles stepped carefully over every crack in the sidewalk. Zara held Queenie tightly and stared at the ground. Nyla rested against Denise's shoulder, tired from being carried across the city. Jalen looked back at the building. The red sign was still in the window. Mama? He said. Did someone really rent it? Denise stopped walking. She could have told him the truth, but the truth would give him another reason to believe people could look directly at his family and lie without shame. She squeezed his hand. Some answers won't help us move forward, she said. We'll keep looking for another door. Jalen nodded, but he looked back once more before the building disappeared behind them. Denise could see the question staying with him. He was beginning to understand that the problem was not their behavior. They could whisper, stand still, and touch nothing, and some people would still see 4 children as 4 reasons to say no. At the bus stop, Denise checked her phone and found a message from another landlord. The woman said she might have a 2-bedroom unit available, but she wanted to meet the entire family before making a decision. Denise read the message twice. It was not a yes, but it was not another closed door either. The next morning, the woman made all 4 children stand in a line on the porch. Then, she began asking which of them broke things. The landlord did not invite them inside. She stood on the porch with a clipboard pressed against her chest and asked Denise to line the children up where she could see them. Jalen moved first, guiding Zara, Miles, and Nyla into a row beside the railing. Denise felt her face grow warm, but she stayed quiet because the apartment behind the woman had 2 bedrooms, working heat, and a rent she could almost afford. She told herself to endure the questions for a few minutes. If the woman said yes, the children would have a safe place before the eviction deadline. The landlord began with Neela. She asked whether the toddler still wet the bed, cried at night, or drew on walls. Then she looked at Miles and wanted to know if he broke toys, threw things, or had trouble following directions. She asked Zara whether she fought with her brothers and whether Queenie carried fleas. By the time she reached Jalen, Denise no longer felt like a mother applying for an apartment. She felt like someone trying to sell 4 damaged products while the buyer searched for reasons to lower their value. They're children, Denise said carefully. They make mistakes, but I take care of them, and I take care of where we live. The woman wrote something on her clipboard. She asked how often the children ran indoors and whether the neighbors at their current building had ever complained about noise. Denise explained that Jalen and Zara attended school during the day, Miles went to preschool, and Neela stayed with a woman from their church while Denise worked. She offered references from her employer and former property manager. The landlord did not ask to see them. Her attention remained fixed on the children. Miles began rubbing the corner of his blanket between his fingers. Zara pushed Queenie behind her back, hiding the bear's missing eye. Neela reached for Denise, but the landlord immediately glanced at the porch railing as if the child might damage it. Jalen noticed. He picked Nyla up before she could start crying and held her against his narrow chest. The woman finally shook her head. 4 children in a 2-bedroom apartment is more trouble than I'm prepared to handle. Before Denise could answer, Jalen stepped forward. I can help, he said. Denise turned toward him, but he continued before she could stop him. He explained that he knew how to sweep floors, wash dishes, take out the trash, and keep his brother and sisters quiet. He promised that Miles would not run inside and that Zara would keep her crayons at the table. He said he could help Denise clean every night after homework. His voice remained steady, as if he had prepared the speech during the long bus ride there. I don't need my own room, Jalen said. I can sleep on the floor. Please just give my mother a room with a door that locks. The landlord stared at him for a moment, then gave a short laugh. It was not loud, but it made Denise's stomach tighten. You're a child, the woman said. You can't promise any of that. Jalen shifted Nyla higher in his arms. I already do it. The woman's smile disappeared, but her answer did not change. She said the apartment was not suitable for their family and wished Denise luck finding somewhere else. Then she went inside and closed the door, leaving them on the porch. Denise stood there for a second, listening to the lock slide into place. Beside her, Jalen lowered Nyla carefully and picked up the diaper bag. They walked 3 blocks before anyone spoke. Miles asked whether he had answered something wrong. Zara wondered if hiding Queenie sooner would have helped. Denise told them they had done nothing wrong, but the words sounded weak after everything they had just heard. At the next corner, Jalen stopped walking. I'm sorry, Mama. Denise turned around. For what? I should have said more. I should have told her I can fix things too. Mr. Collins showed me how to tighten cabinet handles. Denise looked at her son's face and saw that he truly believed he had failed. He was not angry at the landlord. He was angry at himself for being unable to win a home for his family. Denise set down the bags and knelt on the sidewalk in front of him. People moved around them, but she barely noticed. It is not your job to save me, she said. Your job is to go to school, play with your friends, and be a child. Jalen stared at the broken line in the pavement between his shoes. But if I act like a child, who will help you? Denise had no quick answer. She thought about all the times Jalen had washed dishes, packed diapers, given away his food, and carried Nyla when his arms were already tired. She had called him responsible and told him she was proud of him. She had not understood that every compliment had taught him to carry more. While Denise had been trying to keep the family alive, Jalen had quietly decided that her survival was his responsibility too. She pulled him into her arms. At first, his body stayed stiff. Then his hands closed around the back of her coat, and for a few seconds he allowed himself to be held. Denise wished she could promise him that from now on he would never have to worry again. Instead, she made the only promise she could keep. I will keep asking for help, she said, but I won't ask you to become the grown-up in my place. Jalen nodded against her shoulder, though Denise did not know whether he believed her. When they stood, he reached for the diaper bag again. This time, Denise took it first. That evening, she found a message on her phone from Gerald Whitmore. He had a 3-bedroom house available and wanted to meet her the next morning. He had already checked her employment reference and said her rental history looked strong. Denise read the message twice, afraid that hope itself might be another mistake. Then Gerald added one final line. It sounds like your family could be a good fit. Gerald Whitmore was the first landlord who sounded hopeful. He had a 3-bedroom house available, and Denise's work history and rental record impressed him. He asked a few questions, then told her to come by the next morning. Before hanging up, he said, It sounds like this could work. Denise repeated those words to herself all day. That evening, She bought each child a small carton of milk to celebrate, though the money had been meant for breakfast. The next morning, Denise dressed the children in their cleanest clothes. Jalen wore shoes that were already too tight, Zara carried Queenie under one arm, and Miles held Nyla's blue cup. Before they reached the porch, Denise reminded them to stay close and speak softly. Gerald opened the door with a polite smile. He greeted Denise, then looked past her and counted the children. His expression changed. His eyes stopped on Nyla, who was clinging to Denise's neck. For a moment, Gerald seemed unable to move. The sight of the little girl brought back memories he had spent years trying to avoid. 3 children he and Lorraine had lost before they ever had the chance to hold them. He looked away and cleared his throat. "I didn't realize there were 4 children," he said. "I told you I had 4 dependents." "I know. I just didn't picture all of them being this young." Denise explained that she had never missed rent, that she could take extra shifts, and that Jalen helped with the younger children. She offered references and said she would handle small repairs herself. Gerald barely looked at the papers. "I'm not questioning your character," he said. "I just don't want to take on more responsibility than I can manage." Denise held his gaze. "I'm not asking you to carry my responsibilities. I'm asking you not to use my children as a reason to close the door." Gerald rubbed the back of his neck. The house behind him was quiet, clean, and empty. For one second, Denise thought he might change his mind. "I'm sorry," he said. "I can't do it." Denise nodded once. She did not argue or beg. She thanked him for his time, took Miles by the hand, and led the children away. Jalen carried the bags without speaking. Zara pressed Queenie against her chest. None of them asked whether they had gotten the house. As they reached the sidewalk, Neela looked back over Denise's shoulder. She smiled and waved at Gerald, believing that any adult who opened a door must be a friend. Gerald did not wave back. He closed the door, but instead of walking away, he stood behind the curtain and watched the family disappear down the street. The smallest child kept looking back until the house was out of sight. That night, Denise would have nowhere left to ask. By late afternoon, Denise had $83 left. A motel room for 5 people cost more than that, even before taxes. Neela's breathing had started to sound tight again, and the bottle of medicine in Denise's bag was almost empty. She stood outside the pharmacy with the children gathered around her and counted the bills twice. A room might keep them warm for one night. Medicine might keep Neela breathing. Denise bought the medicine. She also bought a small carton of milk, a loaf of bread, and the cheapest jar of peanut butter she could find. When the cashier handed back the change, Denise closed her fingers around it without counting. She already knew it would not be enough for a room. Jalen watched her place the medicine inside his backpack, but he did not ask where they would sleep. The emergency shelter was their last option. Denise called while the children waited beside a bus stop, their 4 small bags at their feet. The woman on the phone sounded tired but kind. Every bed was taken, and dozens of families were already on the waiting list. Denise asked whether there was space on the floor, in a hallway, or anywhere indoors. The answer was still no. She called her sister next. It rang 3 times before she answered in a whisper. She was staying on a friend's sofa and had nowhere to put 5 more people. Denise could hear the shame in her voice, so she quickly said, "It's all right. I only called because I wanted to hear your voice." She ended the call before her sister could ask where they were. The children were still standing under the bus shelter. Zara held Queenie beneath her jacket to protect the stuffed bear from the cold. Jalen had Nyla's medicine ready in case her breathing worsened. Miles sat on one of the bags and watched people pass with grocery bags, car keys, and places to go. Denise gave each child a piece of bread and told them she was not hungry. As she reached into her coat pocket for a tissue, her fingers touched something dry. She pulled out half a piece of bread, hard around the edges, and wrapped in a napkin. Miles immediately looked down. "I saved it for when your stomach starts making noises again," he said. Denise remembered the night before when he had watched her move food around her plate without eating. She took a small bite and offered the rest back to him. Miles shook his head. "You eat it. My stomach is smaller, so it's better at being hungry." Denise could not speak for a moment. She sat beside him, broke the bread in half, and made him eat with her. Jalen turned away, pretending to check Nyla's bag. Zara pressed closer to Denise's side. No one complained that the bread was dry. The sun began to set, and the temperature dropped with it. Denise checked her phone again, though she knew there were no more landlords to call and no shelter beds waiting to open. Across the street, a park had benches beneath several bright lamps. It was not safe, but it was visible, and visibility was the closest thing to protection she had left. She gathered the bags and told the children they were going to rest there until morning. Jalen looked at the darkening sky, then tightened both straps of his backpack. That night, he would decide that someone had to stay awake. The park looked safer from the street than it did once Denise led the children inside. Most of the lights near the playground were broken, and the restroom had already been locked. She chose the bench closest to a working streetlight in the main road, where passing cars might see them. It was not shelter, but it was open and visible. Tonight, that was the best she could give her children. Denise placed the 4 bags beneath the bench. She wrapped Nyla in her coat, then covered Miles and Zara with the thin blanket. It was too small for both of them, so they curled close together with Queenie between them. Nyla lay against Denise's chest, still holding her blue plastic cup. Denise sat on the outside edge, using her body to block the wind. Jalen stayed on his feet. His shoes were still on, and both straps of his backpack were pulled tight over his shoulders. Inside were Nyla's medicine, diapers, the family papers, and the last pieces of bread. Denise told him he could take off the bag and his shoes. Jalen looked toward the road and asked, "What if we have to leave fast?" Denise had no answer. She knew then that he had not come to the park expecting rest. He had come prepared to move again. The wind grew colder after dark. Miles shifted in his sleep, and Zara pulled the blanket higher over him. Denise checked Nyla's forehead and listened to her breathing. It was rough but steady. She told herself they only had to make it until morning. The library would open, the church office would answer, and another shelter might have space. Morning was not a plan, but it was something she could hold on to. Jalen finally sat at the far end of the bench, but he kept the backpack on. His eyes followed every passing car and every shadow near the trees. Denise moved closer and told him to lie down beside Miles. He insisted he was not tired, though she had watched him fall asleep on the bus earlier. When she asked him again, he leaned close so the others would not hear. "Close your eyes for a while, Mama. Tonight, I'll listen for both of us." Denise pulled him against her. He let her hold him, but he did not relax. One hand remained on the backpack strap, and his face stayed turned toward the street. She remembered telling him that his only job was to be a child. Yet here he was, guarding the family because he did not believe anyone else would. For a while, the park stayed quiet. A bus passed without stopping. A bottle rolled across the pavement and struck a fence, making Jalen sit up straight until the sound faded. Denise counted the children's breaths, one after another, because counting gave her something to do with her fear. Then Nyla coughed. The first cough was soft. The second made her whole body tighten. By the third, she was awake and fighting for air. Denise sat upright and pressed her ear to the child's chest. A thin wheeze came with every breath. She opened Jalen's backpack and grabbed the medicine. Her hands shook as she measured the dose. She remembered the doctor's instructions. Keep Nyla upright, stay calm, and give the medicine time to work. Denise held the little girl against her shoulder and whispered that she was safe, even though she was no longer sure. The bottle was almost empty. Jalen dropped beside them and asked if Nyla was going to be okay. Denise said she needed to stay warm. Without waiting, he pulled off his sweater and wrapped it around his little sister. The shirt beneath it was thin, and the wind reached him at once. Denise tried to hand the sweater back, but he moved away. "I'm too warm anyway," he said. "Don't give it back." His teeth were already starting to chatter. Zara and Miles were awake now. Zara held the blanket around both of them and watched Denise's face. Miles hugged Queenie against his chest. Neither child cried. They waited for their mother to tell them how afraid they were allowed to be. Neela's breathing did not improve. Denise checked her phone. The battery was nearly dead, and the hospital was too far to reach on foot. She could call an ambulance, but she did not know what would happen to the other children if she left with Nyla. Jalen would offer to stay with them. He would say he could handle it. The thought of asking an 8-year-old to guard 3 children alone in a dark park finally broke through the wall Denise had built inside herself. For 2 years, she had survived by moving from one problem to the next. She worked, walked, stretched meals, made calls, and kept her voice steady. She never stopped long enough to feel how close she was to falling apart. Now, Nyla was gasping against her chest, Jalen was shivering in a thin shirt, and Denise had no next step. She lowered her face against Nyla's hair. She did not ask for a house or money. She did not ask for anyone to rescue them. She asked only that her baby keep breathing. A pair of headlights moved slowly along the road. Denise raised her head as the car passed the playground, then stopped. The headlights turned toward the bench. Lorraine Whitmore almost took the longer road home that night. The church gathering had ended late, and the temperature had dropped sharply while she was inside. As she drove past the park, her headlights moved across a bench near the road. At first, she thought she saw a pile of blankets. Then, one of the shapes moved, and she realized several children were huddled around a woman holding a little girl against her chest. Lorraine slowed the car. Even from a distance, she could see that the child was working too hard to breathe. She had spent more than 20 years as a nurse, many of them caring for sick children, and she recognized the danger immediately. She pulled over, left the headlights on, and crossed the grass. Denise saw her approaching and tightened her arms around Nyla. Jalen stood up at once and moved between Lorraine and the bench. He was wearing only a thin shirt, but his shoes were still tied, and the backpack remained strapped to his shoulders. Lorraine stopped several feet away. The boy's posture told her that he had been watching over the family for hours. She explained that she was a retired nurse and asked permission to examine Neela. Denise hesitated before giving a small nod. Lorraine knelt beside the bench and listened to the child's breathing. Nyla's chest was rising too quickly, and a faint wheeze followed every breath. Denise showed her the nearly empty medicine bottle and said she had already given the proper dose. Lorraine touched the child's forehead and looked at the sweater wrapped around her small body. It clearly belonged to Jalen. "This little girl needs warmth right now. You don't have to trust me, but please trust someone who spent years caring for children who breathed exactly like this." Denise held Nyla closer. A stranger's kindness could be real, but it could also come with danger, questions, or conditions she could not afford. She looked toward Lorraine's car, then at the 3 children sharing one blanket. Her phone battery was almost dead, and an ambulance might take Neela away while leaving the others with nowhere safe to go. Lorraine told her that the house was less than 10 minutes away. It had heat, hot water, and an old breathing machine she had once used while caring for a family member. Denise and the children could leave whenever they chose. Still, Denise could not bring herself to move. "I don't know you," she said. Lorraine removed her scarf and gently wrapped it around Nyla's shoulders without trying to take the child from her mother. "I'm not asking you to trust me with your whole life. I'm asking you not to let the fear adults have learned keep your daughter out here in the cold." Jalen looked at Lorraine, then turned toward his mother. He gave Denise a small nod. All night, he had watched every shadow and every passing car, but something in Lorraine's calm movements made him lower his guard. Denise heard Nyla struggle through another breath and knew waiting had become more dangerous than leaving. Before getting into the car, Denise asked for Lorraine's full name. When Lorraine said Whitmore, Denise's face changed. She asked whether Lorraine was related to Gerald Whitmore. Lorraine felt the question settle between them. Gerald had briefly mentioned a woman with 4 children earlier that day. He had described the meeting as a rental decision and said the family carried too much risk. He had not mentioned a sick toddler, an exhausted mother, or an 8-year-old boy dressed like he expected to run at any moment. "He turned us away this morning," Denise said. Lorraine looked at the children on the bench and understood what her husband's decision had cost them. She knew Gerald's fears and the losses he had never faced, but none of that could warm these children or help Nyla breathe. Denise began gathering the blanket, ready to refuse the offer now that she knew whose house it was. Lorraine opened the rear door of her car. "What Gerald decided this morning can wait. Tonight, your children need warmth before any of us decide who was right." For a moment, Denise remained still. Then she carried Nyla toward the car. Zara followed with Queenie pressed against her chest, while Miles held tightly to her hand. Jalen gathered all 4 bags before climbing into the back seat. He kept his backpack on and sat nearest the door. Lorraine turned the heat as high as it would go. The children held their hands toward the vents while Denise listened to Nyla's breathing. It was still strained, but the warm air slowly stopped her body from shaking. 10 minutes later, Lorraine turned onto Prescott Street. Her house stood near the end of the block, with warm light glowing through the front windows. Denise looked at it without speaking. She did not know that 2 bedrooms inside had been kept empty for years. Gerald did not know that the family he had rejected was about to enter his home. The first thing the children noticed was the heat. It met them at the front door and slowly loosened the cold from their hands, faces, and shoulders. Denise carried Nyla inside while Jalen brought in all 4 bags, still refusing to let Lorraine help with the backpack. Zara stepped carefully onto the clean floor, holding Queenie against her chest, and Miles stayed close behind her. Nyla reached out and pressed one small hand against the wall, as if she needed to make sure it was real. "Mama, can we sleep here?" Denise looked around the quiet living room. She saw a couch, dry blankets, and windows that kept the wind outside. For one night, her children would not have to sleep with their shoes on or wake at every passing car. Still, she could not call the place a home. That word had begun to feel too dangerous. "Tonight, we're allowed to rest here." Lorraine led them into the kitchen and checked Nyla's breathing again. The warmth was already helping, but she kept the child upright and stayed close until the wheezing softened. Then she filled a pot with broth, noodles, and the few vegetables she had in the refrigerator. Denise offered to help, but Lorraine told her to sit with Nyla. She moved through the kitchen quickly, not asking questions Denise was not ready to answer. The children sat around the table in their coats at first. Jalen chose the chair nearest the doorway and placed the backpack between his feet. Zara kept Queenie in her lap, while Miles watched Lorraine divide the bread into equal pieces. When the soup arrived, no one reached for it until Denise picked up her spoon. Even then, they ate slowly, taking small bites and looking into their bowls before each one. Lorraine had seen hungry children before. She knew hunger did not always make them eat quickly. Sometimes it made them careful because they did not know when the next meal would come. Miles tore his bread in half, ate one piece, and slipped the other beneath his napkin. Lorraine noticed the movement but continued clearing the counter. A few minutes later, she placed 2 more pieces in a small paper bag and set it beside him. "In this kitchen, you don't have to hide food, but you can keep this so you'll know something will still be here in the morning." Miles looked at Denise before touching the bag. When she nodded, he held it with both hands and placed it beside Queenie. He did not eat the bread, having it seemed more important than being full. Denise watched the children finish their soup. Neela ate from Lorraine's old plastic bowl, spilling noodles onto the table. Zara gave part of her bread to Miles when she thought no one was looking. Jalen scraped the bottom of his bowl, then carried it to the sink and began washing it. Lorraine stopped him gently and told him the dishes could wait, but he kept his hands under the running water until Denise asked him to sit down. Only then did Lorraine notice that Denise's bowl had not been touched. Denise said she was not hungry and pushed it toward Jalen. Lorraine moved it back. "Your children have spent the whole night watching you hold them together. They need to see that someone is taking care of you too. Denise looked down at the soup. She had spent so long measuring food by what the children needed that eating felt like taking something from them. Lorraine sat beside her and waited without pushing the bowl again. An exhausted mother cannot keep being a roof over 4 children. Eat for them. Denise picked up the spoon. Her fingers were numb from the cold and weak from going too long without food. Before it reached her mouth, the spoon struck the edge of the bowl and soup spilled across the table. Denise quickly reached for a napkin, embarrassed, but Lorraine placed one hand over hers. No one told her not to cry. No one pretended not to notice. Lorraine simply steadied her wrist while Denise lifted the spoon again. The first bite was small. The second came easier. Across the table, Jalen watched until he saw his mother swallow. Only then did he lean back in his chair. After the meal, Lorraine made beds in the 2 empty rooms. Zara and Miles shared one, while Nyla stayed beside Denise. Jalen stood near the front door, looking at the lock and the distance to the stairs. Lorraine left a blanket on the couch for him without asking why he did not want to sleep farther inside. The house grew quiet after midnight. 4 small bags rested against the wall, and Miles's paper bag of bread sat safely on the kitchen table. Denise lay beside Nyla, listening as her breathing became slow and even. For the first time that night, she allowed herself to close her eyes. None of them heard Gerald's truck pull into the driveway just before sunrise. Gerald Whitmore heard the children before he saw them. He had spent the night at his brother's house after helping repair a broken water line, and he returned just after sunrise expecting the usual silence. Instead, a child laughed somewhere near the kitchen, followed by the sound of a spoon hitting the floor. Gerald stopped in the hallway with his keys still in his hand. No children had lived under this roof in more than 20 years. When he entered the kitchen, he found 4 of them sitting around his table. Miles was eating cereal, while Zara held Queenie beside her bowl, as if the stuffed bear needed breakfast too. Nyla sat in Lorraine's lap, dropping cereal pieces onto the floor one at a time. Jalen stood at the sink, washing the bowls from the night before, even though no one had asked him to do it. Then Gerald saw Denise near the stove, wearing the same clothes she had worn when he turned her away. The room became silent. Denise placed one hand on the back of Nyla's chair, ready to gather the children if Gerald ordered them out. Jalen turned off the faucet, but remained beside the sink. Lorraine did not stand or try to explain in front of the children. She simply met her husband's eyes and waited. Gerald asked Lorraine to speak with him in the bedroom. He kept his voice controlled until the door closed behind them. "You brought 5 strangers into our home without telling me?" Lorraine explained that she had found them sleeping on a park bench. Nyla had been struggling to breathe, Jalen had given the child his sweater, and Denise had been trying to keep all 4 children warm with one coat and a thin blanket. Gerald paced beside the bed, insisting that inviting strangers inside was dangerous. Lorraine allowed him to finish before answering. "You saw them before I did. The difference is that you saw a risk. I saw 5 people freezing in the dark." Gerald looked away. He remembered Denise standing on his porch, calmly listing her references while the children waited behind her. He remembered Nyla waving at him as the family left. At the time, he had told himself that saying no was only a business decision. Now, those same children were eating breakfast in his kitchen because they had nowhere else to go. He reminded Lorraine that they knew almost nothing about Denise. They did not know how long she might stay or what problems might follow her. Lorraine told him Denise had asked for nothing beyond warmth and a safe place for the night. She had cleaned the kitchen before dawn and tried to leave before the children woke because she did not want to cause trouble. Gerald's anger began to lose its strength, but fear remained. The sound of children inside the house had opened something he had kept closed for years. He could not explain that to Lorraine, so he reached for the only thing he could control: time. "They can stay for 48 hours, he said. "After that, they need another plan." Lorraine studied him. She knew that pushing harder might make him close the door completely. "You can put a limit on this house," she said, "but don't pretend your heart doesn't know where they'll go when those hours are over." Gerald returned to the kitchen without answering. Denise had already gathered the children's bags near the front door. She thanked him for allowing them to stay and promised they would cause as little trouble as possible. The promise made Gerald uncomfortable. 4 children should not have to prove that they could exist without being noticed. Jalen had finished the dishes. Every bowl was clean, the counter had been wiped, and the cereal box was back in the cabinet. Gerald looked at the boy's thin arms and then at the backpack waiting beside the door. Jalen had kept his shoes on. Nyla held out a cereal piece in her small hand. "Do you want one?" Gerald looked at the cereal, then at the child's face. He did not take it, but he could not bring himself to tell her no either. He walked past the table and entered the garage, closing the door behind him. For the next 20 minutes, Gerald sat inside his truck without starting the engine. Through the kitchen window, he could see Jalen helping Miles put on his sweater. The boy fixed his brother's collar, picked up a cereal piece from the floor, and placed the bags in a neat row beside the wall. Gerald had given the family 48 hours. For the first time, he wondered whether the deadline was meant to protect his home or protect him from what might happen if the children stayed. Gerald noticed Jalen's shoes before he noticed anything else. The boy wore them at breakfast, kept them on while doing homework, and slept with them tied tightly around his feet. His backpack always stayed beside his head, packed with medicine, diapers, family papers, and clothes for the younger children. Even after Lorraine told him they had 2 full days, Jalen behaved as if someone might order them out before morning. Gerald had seen tenants prepare to leave before, but never a child. On the second morning, Gerald found Jalen asleep on the living room couch. One arm rested over the backpack, and both feet were planted near the floor. Gerald stood there longer than he meant to. The shoes were worn at the toes, and one sole had begun to separate from the side. When Jalen woke, he sat up quickly and looked toward the front door before noticing Gerald. Gerald asked why he never took his shoes off. "If I keep them on, people won't have to wait when they change their minds." Jalen said it without anger or self-pity. To him, it was simply a practical answer. Gerald had spent years believing that caution protected people from disappointment. Now, he saw what constant caution looked like in an 8-year-old boy. Jalen did not expect kindness to last long enough for him to get comfortable. Gerald left for work soon afterward, but the answer followed him. He heard it while inspecting a leaking sink and again while replacing a broken lock at one of his rental units. Each time he opened a door, he pictured Jalen sleeping in his shoes. Gerald had always told himself that renters needed clear rules and firm limits. He had never considered what those limits might teach a child about his right to stay. That afternoon, Gerald carried tools from the garage to his truck. He was repairing a damaged cabinet at another property when Jalen appeared in the driveway. The boy stood a few feet away, watching Gerald lift a heavy metal toolbox from the workbench. After a moment, he asked if he could help. Gerald handed him a smaller bag of supplies, but Jalen reached for the toolbox instead. He gripped it with both hands and lifted. The weight pulled his shoulders forward, yet he tried to keep his back straight as he walked toward the truck. His arms began to shake before he reached the driveway. Gerald took the box from him. "Nobody gives you extra points for hurting yourself." Jalen rubbed his hands against his pants and looked at the ground. "I don't need points. I just need to be useful." The words were quiet, but Gerald understood them clearly. Jalen believed usefulness was the price of being allowed to stay. He washed dishes before anyone asked. He watched the younger children, carried the bags, and cleaned up every small mess before an adult could notice. He was not helping because he enjoyed it. He was trying to make himself harder to send away. Gerald placed the toolbox in the truck and handed Jalen a small flashlight instead. He asked him to check whether it still worked. Jalen pressed the button and a bright beam appeared across the garage wall. Gerald told him to keep it nearby in case they needed it later. For the first time, Jalen was given something without having to carry more than he could handle. That evening, Denise folded the blankets while Lorraine helped Nyla take her medicine. Miles played quietly with his broken toy car, and Zara drew beside him. The house remained cleaner than it had been before they arrived. Every cup was returned to the cabinet, every toy stayed in one corner, and the 4 bags remained packed beside the wall. Gerald passed the living room after midnight and heard Jalen whispering. He stopped outside the doorway. Miles and Zara were lying beneath the same blanket. Neela was asleep beside Denise, but Jalen was still awake, sitting near the bags with his shoes on. He reminded the younger children not to touch anything that did not belong to them. Then he lowered his voice. "Don't spill anything. Don't cry too loudly. Maybe they'll let us stay one more day." Gerald stood in the hallway, one hand resting against the wall. He wanted to enter and tell the boy that children were allowed to laugh, drop cups, and wake from bad dreams. But the promise would mean little while the 48-hour deadline still existed. He returned to his bedroom without saying anything. The next morning, however, Lorraine found that Gerald had moved the family's bags away from the front door. The bags were no longer beside the front door when the children woke. Gerald had moved them into the hallway closet before leaving for work without explaining why. Jalen noticed immediately. He checked the closet twice, making sure the medicine and family papers were still inside, but he did not move the bags back. For the first time since arriving, the entrance looked less like a place where someone was waiting to be sent away. That morning, Miles followed Lorraine into the backyard while she hung towels on the clothesline. A few yellow flowers had grown beside the fence, and he spent several minutes choosing one. By the time he carried it inside, he had held it so tightly that the stem was bent and several petals were crushed. He placed it in Lorraine's hand and looked ashamed. "I found the prettiest one, but my hand hurt it." Lorraine turned the flower slowly between her fingers. To most people, it was only a weed, but Miles had searched the whole yard for it. She found a small glass, filled it with water, and placed the flower near the kitchen window. Some things can be hurt and still be beautiful. They only need someone to hold them gently again. Gerald had returned to get a tool he had forgotten. He heard Lorraine from the hallway and stopped before entering the kitchen. She was looking at the bent flower, but Gerald knew she was speaking about more than a child's gift. For years, he had treated damaged things as problems to remove or repair quickly. Lorraine had always known that people needed something different. Later that afternoon, Neela sat on the living room floor stacking plastic measuring cups. Lorraine was beside her, folding laundry while keeping an eye on the child's breathing. Nyla held up the smallest cup and tried to say Lorraine's name. What came out was Lolo. Lorraine laughed and repeated the name, thinking Neela would try again. Instead, the little girl smiled and called her Lolo a second time. The laughter left Lorraine's face. She looked down at the shirt in her hands and began to cry before she could stop herself. No child had ever given her a name like that. She had once imagined being called Mama, then spent years teaching herself not to imagine it anymore. Now, a little girl she had known for only a few days was reaching for her as if the name had always belonged to her. Neela climbed onto Lorraine's knees and wiped her cheeks with both hands. She asked if Lolo's eyes hurt. Lorraine pulled the child close. "No, sweetheart. Lolo just remembered that her eyes still know how to cry." Gerald saw them from the doorway. Nyla rested against Lorraine's chest, while Lorraine held her with one hand on the child's back. His first instinct was to leave before either of them noticed him. Then Nyla saw him and held out one of the measuring cups. Gerald stepped into the room and accepted it. That evening, Lorraine placed 7 chairs around the dining table. Before the family arrived, the table had usually been set for 2, though Gerald and Lorraine often ate at different times. Now there were bowls, cups, and plates in every place. Gerald entered, counted the chairs, and paused. The children were already sitting down. Miles had placed his broken toy car beside his plate. Jalen helped Nyla into her chair, then checked the floor for anything she might trip over. Zara had saved the seat beside her and pulled it away from the table when Gerald started toward the garage. "I kept this one for you. If you don't sit down, the chair might think nobody needs it." Gerald looked at the empty seat. He could have said he had work to finish, but Zara was waiting with both hands on the chair. He sat down without arguing. At first, the meal was quiet. Denise made sure the children waited until Lorraine began eating. Jalen watched Nyla's cup, ready to catch it if she dropped it. Miles kept one hand near the bread basket, but did not take a second piece. Gerald noticed how carefully they behaved, as though dinner were another test they could fail. Then, Nyla dropped a spoon. Every child froze. Gerald looked at the spoon on the floor, picked it up, and placed a clean one beside her bowl. He did not complain or check for damage. Nyla returned to eating, and the others slowly relaxed. A few minutes later, Miles laughed when his toy car rolled beneath Gerald's chair. Zara told Lorraine about Queenie's missing eye, and Jalen asked Gerald how locks worked. The conversations overlapped until the kitchen no longer sounded like a room where children were trying to disappear. Gerald ate more slowly than usual. He had spent years believing peace meant a quiet house. Sitting at the crowded table, he began to understand that silence and peace were not always the same thing. After dinner, he found the bent flower beside the window. Lorraine had supported its damaged stem with a small piece of tape. The petals were still open toward the last light of the day. Gerald looked toward the living room, where Neela was calling for Lolo, and Zara was laughing beside her. The 48 hours he had given the family were almost over. Yet no one had mentioned the deadline since he moved their bags away from the door. Lorraine waited until the children were asleep before opening the hall closet. Denise sat at the kitchen table, sorting apartment listings and training programs on her phone, when she heard hangers moving in the next room. A few minutes later, Lorraine returned carrying a faded cardboard box. She placed it on the table carefully, as if something inside could still be hurt. The tape had yellowed with age, but the lid was clean. Lorraine had clearly touched it many times without ever opening it. Inside were 3 pairs of tiny socks, folded beside 3 small blankets that had never been used. Beneath them lay a yellow baby outfit with the store tag still attached. Lorraine ran one finger along the sleeve, but did not lift it from the box. She told Denise that she had lost 3 pregnancies over 12 years. The first loss came early enough that people expected her to recover quickly. The second happened after she had already chosen a name. The third nearly took her life. Denise said nothing. She knew some grief became smaller when people spoke about it, but other grief only needed someone willing to sit beside it. Lorraine unfolded one of the blankets and pressed it flat across the table. It was soft and untouched, still waiting for a child who had never come home. "I didn't keep these because I was still hoping," Lorraine said. "I kept them because I was afraid that if I threw them away, there would be nothing left to prove my babies ever existed." Denise looked toward the dark hallway where her children were sleeping. She thought about the box Jalen had packed with their birth certificates and school papers. He had wanted proof that they belonged together. Lorraine had kept this box for the opposite reason, proof that someone had existed even though the world had never met them. Lorraine told her about the final night at the hospital. She had woken in pain, and Gerald drove through empty streets without speaking. When they arrived, he helped her out of the truck but stopped before the emergency room doors. Lorraine went inside alone while Gerald remained in the parking lot for hours. For months afterward, she believed he had abandoned her at the worst moment of her life. She had accused him of being weak and uncaring. Gerald did not defend himself until one night, long after the hospital bills had been paid and the flowers from friends had died. He finally admitted why he had stayed outside. "I was terrified of watching you lose another part of yourself while I stood there unable to save anything." Lorraine had never forgotten the look on his face when he said it. Gerald had not stayed away because he felt nothing. He had stayed away because he felt too much and did not know how to survive it. After that loss, he locked the room they had planned to turn into a nursery. Over time, fishing rods, tackle boxes, and old tools filled the space where a crib had been meant to stand. The house became quieter after that. Lorraine stopped mentioning children, and Gerald stopped opening doors he could not control. He repaired broken pipes, collected rent, and kept every part of his life in order. Rules became easier than grief. Distance became safer than hope. Denise looked at the yellow outfit in the box and remembered Gerald standing in his doorway. She remembered how his expression changed when he saw Nyla in her arms. At the time, she had believed he saw only noise, damage, and responsibility. Now she wondered whether he had seen something else. "Maybe he wasn't afraid my children would damage the house," Denise said. "Maybe he was afraid they would walk into the place where he buried everything." Lorraine closed the box, but kept both hands on the lid. "Pain can explain a person," she said. "It cannot excuse every choice they make." Denise understood. Gerald's grief did not erase the cold night in the park or the way Jalen had sat awake guarding his family, but understanding changed the shape of her anger. Gerald was not simply a hard man protecting his property. He was a frightened man protecting a wound he had mistaken for an empty room. Lorraine carried the box back to the closet. Before putting it away, she took out the yellow outfit and held it against her chest for a moment. Then she folded it again and returned it to the box. Denise helped slide the box behind the winter coats, but neither woman noticed Gerald standing at the far end of the hallway. He had heard enough to know which box they had opened. That night, long after everyone went to bed, Gerald stood outside the locked room filled with fishing equipment. His hand rested on the doorknob, but he did not turn it. Not yet. The trouble began with a blank line on a school form. Jalen's teacher had asked every student to update their home address, but he left that section empty and returned the paper without explanation. When she asked him to complete it, he said he did not know what to write. The address on his old school record was no longer theirs, and Gerald's house did not feel permanent enough to claim. To Jalen, writing it down would make leaving harder when the adults changed their minds. His teacher had noticed other things too. Jalen often struggled to stay awake during morning lessons. At lunch, he wrapped crackers and fruit in napkins and slipped them into his backpack. When she gently asked why, he said Miles sometimes woke up hungry. He spoke as if saving food for his brother was as normal as finishing homework. The school contacted Denise and asked her to attend a meeting. She arrived during her lunch break, still wearing her work badge, and found Jalen sitting outside the office. His backpack rested between his feet, and his shoes were tied tightly. He apologized before she even sat down. Denise told him he had done nothing wrong, but he kept staring at the floor. He believed the meeting was happening because he had failed to hide their situation. Denise took his hand and felt how cold his fingers were. She wanted to tell him adults would fix everything. Instead, she promised only that they would face whatever came next together. A social worker joined them in the office. She was calm and careful with her words, but the message was clear. The school needed proof that the children had a stable place to live. If Denise could not provide an address or written permission from the homeowner, Child Services might have to arrange temporary care until she found permanent housing. The word temporary made Denise stop listening for a moment. Terrence had used that word the morning before he disappeared. He had said he needed a little time to clear his head. 2 years later, he still had not come back. Denise knew that temporary separations could stretch into months, and months could become a childhood. She looked through the office window at Jalen. He was sitting with his backpack on his lap, watching the door. Zara, Miles, and Nyla were safe with Lorraine, but Denise suddenly pictured strangers arriving to divide the children between different homes. Jalen would try to stay with the younger ones. He would promise to clean, work, and cause no trouble. Someone would still tell him the decision was not his. The social worker explained that a signed statement from Gerald could solve the immediate problem. He only needed to confirm that Denise and the children were allowed to live in his home. It would not make him their guardian or require him to support them. It would simply show that the children had a safe place to stay while Denise searched for housing. Gerald came home while the social worker was explaining the same thing at the kitchen table. He had not known about the meeting until he saw the woman's folder and Denise's tense expression. Lorraine stood near the stove, holding Nyla, while Jalen waited in the hallway with the other children. The social worker asked Gerald whether he was willing to sign. Gerald looked at the form. His name, address, and signature would turn the family's stay from a private act of kindness into something official. He thought about insurance, legal responsibility, and all the rules he had spent his life following. He also thought about Jalen sleeping in his shoes and the bags he had moved away from the door. But he said nothing. The silence lasted only a few seconds, yet Denise felt every one of them. She saw the fear in Gerald's face and understood that he was not ready. She also knew the social worker was watching his hesitation. Denise reached for the form. "Mr. Whitmore is under no obligation to take legal responsibility for us. I'll find another solution." Lorraine turned toward her husband, but Denise shook her head before she could argue. She would not force Gerald to make a promise out of guilt. She had spent too much of her life depending on people who stayed only until responsibility became uncomfortable. The social worker gave Denise 3 days to provide another address or written housing plan. After she left, the children returned to the kitchen. Jalen looked from his mother to Gerald, trying to understand what had happened. Denise smiled and told him they were still working things out. Gerald watched her gather the papers and place them in Jalen's family box. She had protected him in front of the social worker, even though his silence might cost her the children. He wanted to explain that he only needed time, but the words felt useless. Denise did not have time. That night, Gerald found the unsigned form on the kitchen table. Beside it was Zara's drawing of 7 people standing in front of one house. The deadline was 3 days away. By morning, Denise had already found a solution, but it would require her to leave her children behind. Denise found the program the morning after the social worker's visit. It offered 6 weeks of medical training, a small room for each student, and help finding full-time work afterward. Graduates were often hired by local clinics and hospitals, which meant steady pay, health insurance, and a real chance to qualify for an apartment. On paper, it looked like the first clear path forward she had seen in months. Then she reached the final line of the application: no children permitted in residential housing. She read the sentence several times before closing the page. The program began in 4 days, 1 day after the social worker's deadline. If Denise accepted, Lorraine could keep the children while she trained. They would remain together, attend the same schools, and sleep in the same house. Denise could return on weekends, and after 6 weeks, she might finally earn enough to give them a permanent home. It was a good plan, but every part of it required her to walk away from her children. That evening, Denise waited until they were asleep before speaking to Lorraine. Gerald was still at work, and the 2 women sat at the kitchen table with the program application between them. Lorraine read every page carefully. She agreed to care for the children, but she could see that Denise was not asking only whether the plan was possible. She was asking whether leaving made her a bad mother. Denise looked toward the hallway. Neela had never spent more than 1 night away from her. Miles still called for her when he woke from a bad dream, and Zara needed help with her hair before school. Jalen would try to manage everything himself, even if Lorraine told him not to. Denise knew exactly what 6 weeks without her would ask of each child. "I would rather have them cry because they miss me for 6 weeks than spend their childhood afraid of where they'll sleep tomorrow." Lorraine reached across the table and covered Denise's hand. She reminded her that choosing temporary pain to build a safer future was not abandonment. Terrence had left because responsibility became difficult. Denise was considering leaving because she wanted to carry that responsibility better. The difference mattered, even if the children were too young to understand it at first. Neither woman knew Jalen was standing outside the kitchen. He had woken when Nyla started coughing and had gone to find her medicine. From the hallway, he heard only pieces of the conversation. He heard that the program did not allow children. He heard Denise say they could not stay together. He heard Lorraine promise to keep them while their mother went away. Then Denise began crying, and Jalen stepped back before either woman saw him. He returned to the living room and sat beside the family's bags. The social worker's visit, Gerald's unsigned form, and the new plan joined together in his mind. Adults were trying to find somewhere to send them because Denise could not keep all 4 children. Every landlord had become colder after counting them. Now, even the program that could save his mother's future would accept her only if she came alone. Jalen opened his backpack and checked what was inside. Nyla's medicine was in the front pocket. The family documents remained sealed in plastic. There were diapers, tissues, 2 shirts, and several crackers he had saved from school. He added the flashlight Gerald had given him and pushed the backpack beneath the couch before anyone could notice. The next day, Denise told the children about the program. She explained that she might have to sleep somewhere else for a few weeks, but Lorraine would care for them and Denise would return every weekend. Zara began crying before Denise finished. Miles asked whether 6 weeks meant 6 nights. Neela climbed into Denise's lap and held tightly to her shirt. Jalen did not react. He asked practical questions instead. He wanted to know when the program started, how far away it was, and whether the social worker would return before then. Denise mistook his calmness for understanding. She thanked him for being strong, not realizing that he had already begun making another plan. That night, Zara woke and found Jalen packing crackers into his backpack. He motioned for her to stay quiet and led her into the bathroom where their voices would not carry into the hallway. Zara asked whether their mother was really going to leave. Jalen told her Denise was trying to protect them, but adults could still separate the family if she failed. He had heard enough conversations to believe that once strangers took them away, no one could promise they would stay together. "If we leave first, nobody can split us up," he said. "Mama can finish her program, find a home, and then we'll come back." Zara stared at him. She asked where they would sleep and how their mother would find them. Jalen said they would go to the storage unit where Denise kept their belongings. It had walls, a door, and everything that proved they were a family. He would leave a note so she would know they were safe. Zara knew the plan was wrong, but Jalen had found food when they were hungry, carried Nyla when Denise was tired, and stayed awake in the park while everyone else slept. In Zara's world, her brother was the person who always knew what to do when adults had no answers. She slowly nodded. Jalen told her to wear her shoes to bed and keep Queenie inside her coat. He planned to take Zara and Miles before sunrise, leaving Neela with Denise because she was too young and needed her mother's care. But sometime after midnight, Nyla woke and saw the 3 of them preparing to leave. When Jalen lifted the backpack, she reached for him and refused to let go. Denise woke before sunrise because the house was too quiet. Nyla usually moved in her sleep, Miles talked during dreams, and Jalen was often awake before everyone else. That morning, there was nothing. Denise reached toward the space beside her and found only a cold blanket. She sat up, called Nyla's name, then hurried into the living room. The couch was empty and the front door was not fully closed. At first, Denise told herself the children were in the kitchen or backyard. Then she saw the empty place beneath the couch where Jalen had hidden his backpack. Neela's medicine was gone. So were several crackers, 2 bottles of water, and the flashlight Gerald had given him. The 4 small bags remained in the closet, but the children's coats and shoes were missing. Jalen had not packed for comfort. He had packed only what he believed they needed to survive. Denise found Zara's drawing on the pillow. It showed Denise and the 4 children standing in front of a house, but heavy black lines had been drawn across the children. Beneath the picture, Zara had written slowly and unevenly, "Mama will find a home more easily when she doesn't have to carry us." Denise read the sentence once, then she read it again because her mind refused to understand what her eyes were seeing. She pressed the paper against her chest and called for Lorraine. By the time Lorraine entered the room, Denise was already pulling on her coat with shaking hands. She kept repeating that Jalen had misunderstood, that she had never planned to leave them, and that he must believe they were the reason every door had closed. Gerald came into the hallway as Denise reached the front door. For 1 second, he stood frozen while Lorraine explained. Then he grabbed his keys and called the police. There were no questions about whether the children had permission to leave or whether Denise should have watched them more closely. Gerald gave their names, ages, clothing, and Nyla's medical condition. His voice remained steady until the dispatcher asked whether the children had somewhere they might consider safe. Denise ran outside before he finished the call. Rain had begun to fall, light at first, then harder as the sky brightened. Denise checked the park where they had slept, the bus shelter where they had shared bread, and the church steps where she had once waited for help. She called each child's name until her throat hurt. Every small figure in the distance made her run faster. Every time it turned out to be someone else, the fear grew worse. Gerald drove through bus stations, parking lots, and streets lined with closed stores. He checked vacant properties he owned and buildings he knew had broken locks. He called his brother, several tenants, and every worker who might be awake. For the first time in years, Gerald did not think about liability, rules, or what could go wrong if he became involved. He thought only about Jalen in wet shoes, trying to protect 3 children with crackers and a flashlight. At the park, Gerald found the bench empty. Rainwater ran across the wooden seat and collected beneath the streetlight. He remembered Nyla waving at him from Denise's arms and Jalen washing dishes in his kitchen as if work could earn safety. Gerald had watched the boy prepare to leave every day and had still waited too long to tell him he could stay. Now, he was terrified that he might never get the chance. Denise returned to the house soaked and without the children. She could barely hold the drawing because the rain had softened the paper. Lorraine wrapped a towel around her shoulders, but Denise pushed it away. They think I'll be better without them. Lorraine took the drawing and studied the house, the crossed-out children, and Zara's careful handwriting. She thought about Jalen's backpack, the family papers, and every place he had treated as temporary. Then she remembered something he had said while helping move their belongings. The storage unit was the only place that still held everything that belonged to them. To Jalen, it was not only a room filled with boxes, it was proof that the family had existed before every landlord began turning them away. The storage unit, Lorraine said. He thinks that's where the family is still together. Gerald was already reaching for his keys. Denise climbed into the truck before he could open the passenger door. Lorraine called the police with the address while Gerald drove through the rain. Denise held Zara's damaged drawing in both hands and watched the streets pass. She did not ask Gerald to slow down. The storage facility stood behind a locked gate on the edge of the city. The office was closed, and the rows of metal doors disappeared into the rain. Gerald called the emergency number posted near the entrance, while Denise searched along the fence for another way in. Then she saw a small blue plastic cup lying near the gate. Nyla's cup. Denise picked it up and began running. Far inside the property, behind one of the metal doors, a child coughed. Gerald heard it too. He climbed over the gate without waiting for it to open, landed badly, and kept moving. Denise followed him through the rain, calling the children's names. At the end of the last row, they saw a thin line of flashlight shining beneath the door of Denise's storage unit. Gerald reached for the lock. From inside, Jalen's voice warned the others to stay behind him. Gerald pulled up the storage unit door, and cold air rushed out. The flashlight on the floor lit only part of the narrow space, but it was enough to reveal 4 small bodies among the boxes. Zara and Miles were asleep beneath an old blanket. Neela lay between them with her blue cup tucked against her chest. Jalen sat in front of the door with his back against a stack of boxes, placing himself between his siblings and anyone who entered. His clothes were soaked from the rain, and his lips had begun to lose their color. One hand held the flashlight. The other was wrapped tightly around Nyla's medicine bottle. When Gerald stepped closer, Jalen raised the light toward him and told the younger children to stay back, even though they were still asleep. He looked exhausted, but he had not allowed himself to close his eyes. Denise rushed past Gerald and dropped to her knees beside the children. She touched each face and checked each breath before pulling Neela into her arms. Zara woke and immediately began crying. Miles opened his eyes, saw his mother, and reached for her coat. Denise held all three of them as closely as she could, repeating that she had never wanted to leave them. Jalen remained near the door. Denise reached for him, but he moved back. He looked at his siblings, then at the drawing still crushed in his mother's hand. The plan had failed, and he seemed to believe that failure had made everything worse. Gerald knelt several feet away so the boy would not feel trapped. "Why did you bring them here?" Jalen tried to answer calmly, but his voice broke. He said the storage unit had walls, food, blankets, and everything their family owned. He believed Denise could finish her training and find an apartment if she no longer had to explain 4 children to every landlord. Each time adults counted them, the answer changed. Gerald had done it. The other landlords had done it. Even the training program would take Denise only if the children stayed behind. "If the 4 of us disappear, someone will give Mama a room," Jalen said. "Everyone says no after they count us." Denise covered her mouth. She had known her children felt unwanted, but she had never understood how deeply that belief had settled inside her son. Jalen had not run away because he wanted freedom. He had removed himself from his mother's life because he believed that was the most useful thing he could do for her. Gerald looked at the boy and saw every choice that had brought them there. He remembered closing the door while Nyla waved. He remembered setting a 48-hour deadline and leaving the school form unsigned. Jalen had watched adults turn fear into rules, then learned to treat his own existence as a problem that needed solving. Gerald lowered his eyes. "Adults made you believe you were a burden," he said. "That is our failure, not yours." Jalen stared at him. Rainwater dripped from his hair onto his shirt. He did not seem ready to believe any adult could admit being wrong, especially the man whose door had closed first. By morning, Gerald had made a decision. Denise's children would not return to the living room floor while she completed her training. The room would become theirs. He carried the last tackle boxes into the garage, opened the window, and measured the walls for 2 beds. Lorraine watched from the doorway, but did not ask whether he was certain. The empty floor had already answered for him. Gerald bought lumber that afternoon. He could have purchased ready-made beds, but he wanted to build them himself. Jalen stood near the garage and watched him mark the boards. He did not ask to help. After the storage unit, he seemed unsure whether Gerald's promise was still real. Gerald handed him a piece of sandpaper and pointed to one of the boards. Jalen began working immediately, pressing so hard that his arm grew tired. Gerald showed him how to move slowly and feel the wood with his palm. When Jalen found a rough spot, Gerald asked him to keep sanding until it disappeared. "This edge has to be perfectly smooth. Children should be able to sleep without worrying about getting hurt." Jalen looked at him, then back at the board. For once, no one was asking him to prove he deserved a place in the house. He was helping build something that had already been promised to him. His shoulders relaxed, and a small smile appeared before he could hide it. Gerald saw it and smiled too. Over the next 2 days, the room changed. The fishing racks came down, the walls were cleaned, and 2 simple beds took shape in the garage. Zara chose a soft lavender paint after Gerald showed her several color cards. Miles placed his broken toy car on the windowsill to make sure the room was safe. Neela walked in circles across the empty floor, calling for Lolo whenever Lorraine disappeared from view. Denise stood in the doorway and watched Gerald attach the final bedrail. She tried to thank him, but he stopped her. He told her the children needed a room while she trained, and the house had room to give. He did not call it charity or forgiveness. He simply continued tightening the screws. That evening, Jalen placed the family box beneath one of the beds. Then he removed his shoes. Gerald noticed, but said nothing. For the first time since arriving, Jalen fell asleep without his backpack beside his head. On the wall above him, the paint was still drying. In the hallway, the old key remained in the lock, but the door stayed open. The social worker returned 2 days after Gerald opened the locked room. This time, the housing form was already waiting on the kitchen table. Gerald had filled in his address, confirmed that Denise and the children could stay for 6 months, and signed his name at the bottom. He had also prepared a second document, a lease for a 2-bedroom apartment that would soon become available in one of his buildings. The rent was lower than the other places Denise had applied for, and the deposit could be paid in small amounts after she began working. Denise read both documents slowly. For weeks, every application had required her to prove she was safe, responsible, and worthy of a home. Now Gerald was placing his own name beside hers and accepting responsibility for the promise. She looked at the future lease, then pushed it back across the table. She told him she did not want the family to become a charity project he later regretted. Gerald did not push the papers back immediately. He admitted that when Denise first came to his door, he had judged the risk before looking at the family. He had protected his property while ignoring what his refusal might cost 5 people. The apartment would not erase that choice, but it could be the beginning of a better one. "This is not charity," he said. "It is the opportunity I should have given you the first time you knocked on my door." Denise studied his face, looking for pity or guilt. She found neither. Gerald was offering her time to become stable, not asking her to remain dependent on him. She picked up the pen and signed. Jalen watched from the hallway, his shoes untied and his backpack resting in the new bedroom. When the social worker approved the plan, he did not celebrate. He only went into the room, opened the family box, and placed the signed document beside their birth certificates. The medical training program began the following Monday. Because Denise now had approved housing, she no longer had to live in the program's residence. She left the house before 7 each morning and returned after clinical practice in the evening. Her days were filled with lessons, examinations, and long hours learning procedures she had once only watched from behind a hospital desk. At night, she studied at the kitchen table while the children slept nearby. Denise told him that the training program had never meant she wanted a life without them. She was trying to build a future where none of them had to pack again. Jalen listened, but his hand remained around Nyla's medicine. He had spent too long expecting good plans to fall apart. When Gerald reached for the bottle, Jalen pulled it closer to his chest. He said Nyla might need it and refused to move away from the entrance. Even with Denise beside him and the police outside the gate, he still believed someone had to protect the others. Gerald took off his coat and placed it over Jalen's shoulders. The coat nearly covered the boy's entire body. Jalen did not resist, but he kept watching the door. "You've been standing guard for too long," Gerald said. "Tonight, let me do it." Jalen searched Gerald's face. He had heard promises from adults before, and many had lasted only until morning. "Will you change your mind tomorrow?" Gerald felt the question more deeply than any accusation. He could not erase the park bench, the empty school form, or the hours Jalen had spent freezing beside the door. He could only decide what kind of man would answer now. "If I ever do, you have the right to remind me of the man who made this promise." Jalen's grip on the medicine slowly loosened. Gerald took the bottle and handed it to Denise, then remained on the floor beside him. He did not tell the boy to stop crying or promise that everything would become easy. He simply stayed. For the first time, Jalen allowed his shoulders to drop. He leaned forward until his forehead touched Gerald's chest. A moment later, the rest of his weight followed. Gerald wrapped one arm around him carefully, holding the child who had once stood on his porch and offered to sleep on the floor. Denise watched her son rest his head against the shoulder of an adult who was not her. Jalen's shoes were still wet, his clothes were cold, and the future was still uncertain. But for the first time since Terrence left, he was no longer the person closest to the door. Gerald carried him to the truck. When they returned to the house, he did not move the family's bags back into the hallway. Instead, he walked to the locked room filled with fishing equipment and stood outside it with the key in his hand. Gerald waited until everyone was asleep before returning to the locked room. The key had been on his ring for years, though he rarely touched it. When the door opened, the smell of dust and old wood moved into the hallway. Fishing rods covered one wall, tackle boxes were stacked beneath the window, and shelves held tools he had not used in years. Gerald stood in the doorway and remembered the room before it became storage. He and Lorraine had once measured the wall for a crib and argued over where to place a rocking chair. After their final loss, he had filled every empty space so he would not have to remember what the room was meant to hold. He began carrying things into the garage. One box became 2, then 5. He removed the fishing racks, folded an old chair, and cleared the shelves until the walls slowly appeared again. Near the bottom of a cabinet, he found a faded cardboard box hidden behind several blankets. He knew what it was before he lifted the lid. Inside were 3 pairs of tiny socks, 3 unused blankets, and the yellow baby outfit Lorraine had shown Denise. Gerald picked up one pair of socks and held them in his palm. They were so small that both fit inside one hand. For years, he had told himself that looking away was the same as moving on. But the socks were still there, and so was everything he had refused to feel. Lorraine found him sitting on the floor beside the open box. His shoulders were shaking, and the tiny socks were still in his hand. In the past, Gerald would have stood up, wiped his face, and pretended he had dust in his eyes. This time, he did not hide. I thought that if I locked this room, everything we lost would eventually stop calling my name. Lorraine sat beside him. She looked at the cleared walls, the open box, and the man who had spent years protecting himself from a room he could never truly escape. They never needed you to forget them. They only needed you to stop locking away the part of yourself that was still alive. Gerald lowered his head. Lorraine put her arms around him, and for the first time, neither of them tried to be strong for the other. They cried for the children they had imagined but never raised. They cried for the hospital parking lot, the empty crib, and the years when silence had replaced every conversation they were too afraid to have. Nothing was fixed that night, but the grief was no longer locked behind one door. Lorraine cared for Nyla and Miles during the day. Nyla followed her through the house, calling for Lolo, while Miles helped place the bent flowers glass near the window each morning. Gerald drove Jalen and Zara to school on his way to work. At first, the children sat quietly in the truck. Within a week, Zara was asking him questions about every building they passed, and Jalen was checking the toolbox to make sure nothing had been left behind. The house changed around them. Shoes collected near the door. Zara's drawings covered the refrigerator. A chair was always slightly out of place because Nyla dragged it across the kitchen. At dinner, Miles no longer hid bread beneath his napkin. He sometimes asked for another piece before finishing the first, simply because he had learned the basket would not disappear. Gerald no longer ate in the garage. He joined the family most evenings, though he still spoke less than everyone else. Sometimes he caught himself listening to the noise and waiting for it to bother him. Instead, he began noticing the quiet moments beneath it. Jalen helping Miles read, Denise studying while Nyla slept against her shoulder, and Lorraine laughing from another room. The house had not become less peaceful. It had simply stopped being empty. 6 weeks passed faster than Denise expected. She completed every exam, missed no clinical hours, and was offered an interview at a local hospital before the program ended. The morning of graduation, Lorraine helped her press the white uniform she had been given for the ceremony. Denise stood in front of the mirror for a long time. She had worn second-hand uniforms and repaired work clothes for years. This was the first outfit she had earned by building something new. The children sat together in the front row. Zara had drawn a graduation cap on Queenie. Miles kept asking when his mother would come onto the stage, and Nyla called Mama whenever any woman in white appeared. Gerald sat at the end of the row, holding the program in both hands. Lorraine watched Denise's empty chair on stage with the same attention she once gave hospital monitors, waiting for proof that the difficult part had passed. When Denise's name was called, Jalen stood. He did not clap at first. He watched his mother walk across the stage with a certificate in her hands, as if he needed to memorize every step. This was the woman he had seen skip meals, walk to work, lose a home, and hold Nyla through a night in the cold. For years, Jalen had believed he had to help carry her. Now he was watching her move forward without needing him to stand guard. Then his face changed. "Mama, this time we really made it." The room turned toward him, but Jalen did not sit down. Zara and Miles began clapping. Nyla shouted because everyone else was making noise, and Lorraine covered her mouth with one hand. Gerald rose beside them and applauded until Denise reached the other side of the stage. Denise began crying before she received the certificate. She looked toward the children and understood that Jalen had not said "you made it." He had said "we." Every meal shared, every door closed, every night survived, and every hand that had finally reached for them had brought the family to this moment. 2 weeks later, Denise accepted a full-time hospital position. The apartment Gerald had promised was ready. For the first time, the Calloway family would be packing their bags because they had somewhere permanent to go. The Calloway family moved into their apartment on a Saturday morning. It was small, with 2 bedrooms, plain floors, and a kitchen window that faced the sunrise. Gerald had replaced the locks, repaired the loose cabinet doors, and painted the walls before handing Denise the keys. There was no furniture except a used table Lorraine had found and the beds Gerald had built, but every room belonged to them. For the first time in months, their bags were carried inside without anyone warning them that the stay was temporary. Neela ran from room to room, opening each door and closing it again. Miles placed his broken toy car on the living room windowsill. Zara chose the wall where she wanted to hang her drawings, while Denise stood in the kitchen with the keys pressed tightly inside her hand. She had imagined this moment during long walks to work and nights when the children slept beside her in unfamiliar places. Now that it had arrived, she was almost afraid to move, as if the apartment might disappear if she believed in it too quickly. Jalen carried the family box into the bedroom he would share with Miles. He placed it on the floor, then pressed his palm against the wall. He felt the paint, the plaster, and the solid surface beneath them. After a moment, he looked at Denise. "Do we have to pack again tomorrow morning?" Denise shook her head. "Tomorrow, you'll wake up in this same room." Jalen opened the box, but did not empty it quickly. He removed one shirt, folded it again, and placed it inside the closet. Then, he took out a school book and set it on the shelf. Denise watched him handle each item as if it might be taken away if he moved too fast. "I want moving in to last a little longer," he said. "I need time to believe we're staying." Denise sat beside him and helped unpack without rushing. When the box was empty, Jalen folded it flat, but did not throw it away. He slid it beneath the bed. Some habits could not disappear in one day, but that night he slept without his shoes and left his backpack across the room. Zara finished her old drawing during their first week in the apartment. She added Gerald and Lorraine beside Denise and the children, making 7 people in front of the same brown house with the red door. In the first version, 2 figures had stood outside. This time, everyone was together beneath the porch light. Zara gave the picture to Gerald when he came to repair a window latch. Gerald studied it in silence. Then he carried it to his rental office and hung it above the desk where he reviewed applications. Every time he saw the 7 figures, he remembered the morning he had looked past Denise and counted her children as risks. The drawing became a reminder to look at the family before the numbers. Gerald changed his rental policies slowly but completely. He lowered security deposits for single parents, allowed payment plans, and added locks, outlet covers, and safer railings to several apartments. He stopped rejecting applicants after seeing how many dependents they had. Instead, he asked what had made stable housing difficult and what kind of plan might help them move forward. Not every family qualified, and not every problem had a simple answer, but no one was dismissed before being heard. The house on Prescott Street remained part of the children's lives. Every Sunday, Lorraine arrived with enough food to fill Denise's refrigerator for several days. Nyla always ran toward the door calling for Lolo before Lorraine had time to set down the bags. Miles continued bringing her flowers, though he had learned to hold the stems gently. Zara covered Lorraine's refrigerator with drawings, and Denise sometimes stayed at the kitchen table after dinner, talking with the woman who had once stopped her car instead of driving past. Gerald began taking Jalen fishing on Saturday mornings. They did not speak much while waiting beside the lake, but the silence between them no longer felt empty. One afternoon, Jalen looked at the old fishing rods resting beside their chairs. They were the same rods that had once filled the locked room. He asked Gerald why he had kept them. Gerald watched the fishing line move across the water. The rods didn't cause the pain. What matters is the memories we make with them now. Jalen nodded and returned his attention to the lake. A few minutes later, he caught a small fish. Gerald helped him remove the hook, and together they released it back into the water. Jalen smiled as it disappeared beneath the surface. He was no longer trying to prove he was useful. He was simply spending a morning with someone who had promised to stay. Months later, on a cold evening, Denise noticed a young woman standing beneath the apartment awning. The woman held a baby beneath her coat and had 2 bags at her feet. Rain was blowing across the walkway, and she kept checking a phone that appeared to be dead. Denise recognized the look on her face. It was the expression of someone trying to solve too many problems before allowing herself to be afraid. Denise opened the door and carried out a towel. She did not ask for an explanation or proof that the woman deserved help. She asked whether the baby was warm and whether they needed somewhere dry to sit. The woman hesitated, looking past Denise into the apartment as though kindness might hide a condition. Behind Denise, Jalen reached for the switch beside the door. The porch light came on, spreading across the wet steps and the dark walkway. "Leave it on, Mama," he said. "Someone else might be looking for a door that won't close." Denise stepped aside and held the door open. Once, she had needed only one person to stop, one family to make room, and one door to remain open long enough for her children to walk through. Years later, the Callaways had become the people who left the light on for whoever came next.